You needed this one light on, didn't you? Okay.
This is great.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Well, yeah, thank you so much, Liz, and to Margaret for inviting me here. We spent, despite the rainy weather yesterday, we spent a beautiful afternoon touring the community. And I've got to say, you guys have a really remarkable place here. And I'm honored to be part of the conversation this morning. Having lived and worked in a few different areas of the country, I'm excited to talk about the importance of region-specific, community-centric architecture. So just a quick roadmap for today. I'm going to take a look at the trajectory of our past and present places, talk about the roles that architecture, preservation, government, and the public have in shaping a better future, and then take a look at a few case studies from our work in Rhode Island that maybe illustrate some of these points. The theme for this morning is our past and future cities, and that frames our discussion of the built environment around time, which is an interesting lens through which we can look at the built communities, because I think the past is some of the best source material we have to discover what works well and to help us evaluate what we want for the future. And if we don't take time to define where we want to head, then it's impossible to prioritize what we're doing in the present, where we have some agency to shape these things. So if we consider what the most important reason that cities and towns exist, I think it's ultimately to support people with meaningful places in the present and the future. So are the things that we're sort of de facto building today on a good trajectory? And I wonder if maybe not. I think much of the building we're doing today might be dissolving the character of our places. And this is especially a problem that we've noticed in smaller areas like some of the communities around Providence and Providence itself. And I think this is something that we have in common with some of the areas here in the Tri-City area, because there are these historic town centers, and they're now facing opportunities to expand, densify, but we want to make sure that the changes we're making and the new development that's coming in isn't going to slowly turn us into sort of generic anyplace USA. Here's a lot of what's being built in the United States today. And I'm sorry to show such vulgar images this early in the morning. These are from across the country, but it's hard to tell whether these are right down the street or 3,000 miles away. And this, again, unfortunately, is some of our de facto development, which is to say cars first, brands second, and regional identity, the pedestrian experience, good luck. Here's some examples of residential buildings that maybe take a similar approach. Cars first, maybe land second, and regional connection, pretty much none. Broadly speaking, I think the commonalities of this character-dissolving architecture are that they don't make any effort to connect with their neighbors, either the people or the buildings, and they ultimately don't create a place that you want to spend time in, a place that revives and reinvigorates your spirit. And we could say, you know, so what? The construction costs for this type of development are cheap and predictable. They're fast and easy to build. And in a lot of cases, these buildings function just fine. So does it matter that this is our present? And I think it does. And I think we're selling ourselves and really our future selves and our children short by not taking stock in the present of what's going on towards the future. And I think since all of you gave up a Saturday morning to talk about this, clearly some people are passionate about it too. Our physical environments play a huge role in our experience of the world, especially our understanding of communal identity. The relationship between communal identity and place is complicated, so I don't want to oversimplify that, but I think it's clear that humans have long taken comfort in belonging to well-formed groups. It's that pack animal part of our instincts. And this desire for shared experiences and strong identity manifests itself in the infrastructure we build to support ourselves. We're attracted to physical infrastructure that reflects the strong character of our communities, and we want to live in a place that we can be proud of. I think today it's harder to attach our understanding of communal identity to the built environment as we once did because of a few factors, the first of which are demographics. It's not that Americans are moving further away from our sort of family home base than we used to. I think the average American still lives something like 18 miles from their mother. But more people than ever are living alone or in isolated sort of auto-centric developments where you need a car to get in and out. I'll So there's the changing forces of technology, whereas we used to have to go outside the house to socialize. Now we can do it from our couch. The demise of brick and mortar establishments to shop and gain entertainment. We don't really need to leave the house to do either of those either. And then the rise of national chains and national developers who bring this one-size-fits-all model that is slowly increasing monotony. So given these factors that are chipping away at our communal identity, I think it's understandable why people will be drawn to authentic places with a definable character. But if this doesn't convince you, there's also an economic argument to be made. This is a great quote from Ed McMahon, who's the chair on sustainable development at the Urban Land Institute. And I think he's right. Communities are competing to gain business, and those businesses are competing to attract and keep high-quality workers. And this is a lot easier to do if they're located in a high-quality community that people want to live in and want to invest in. So there's a little bit of data to back this claim up. Between 2007 and 2010, the Knight Foundation and the Gallup Polling Institute ran a study called The Soul of the Community, and they conducted about 14,000 interviews across 26 communities throughout those years. And researchers found that cities where people had the highest levels of attachment to their place also had the highest levels of GDP growth. And of these 10 factors that they were sort of interviewing for, they found that physical beauty and a city's welcomeness and openness to all people were most related to feeling attracted to a particular place. So in other words, having a beautiful and welcoming physical environment translates to some tangible economic benefits. And tacking on to that, if the people who live in a place love it, then they'll surely want to encourage others to come and visit. So a second piece of the economic argument is tourism. The World Bank estimates that tourism is the largest industry in the world right now. And there are economists that have noted that even if a city or a town doesn't have a major landmark or a major recreational area, it can still foster a successful tourist environment if it has a historic downtown or some kind of a soul of place that people seek to enjoy. Because really, why would you travel and spend money to go somewhere that looks and feels exactly like where you came from? I'm sort of convinced that some of the rise in the Airbnb trend is that people enjoy staying in places that feel true to the local spirit of a place. There may be plenty of other ways that we can slice this economic argument, but I think our problem at hand really boils down to the role we expect the built environment to play in our everyday lives. We often pay a lot of attention to the major cultural and civic structures that come into an area, but often we ignore the places that we interact with on a daily basis, the Home Depots, the Walgreens, etc. So if we believe that the purpose of architecture is to make our lives better, then I think we have a responsibility to ask, do the buildings we encounter on a daily basis have a positive impact? And if they don't, how can we improve them? So my de facto first step in an endeavor like this is to look at a little bit of history and see what did we do before and where did we come from. I think we do want to be careful not to let this nostalgia for some idealized version of the past cloud the way that we look at the present and towards the future, but I do think there are several important lessons that we could take from a sort of broad strokes history of the American regional built environment. So if we start, we could consider how the indigenous peoples of North America created regionally based structures around the country. These were brilliant combinations of form and function that responded to the local climate with local materials. When the European colonists invaded, they probably should have paid more attention to the Native American knowledge, but they brought with them new patterns of development from Europe and adapted them for the local climates with readily available materials. If we consider a historic North Carolina farmhouse versus a historic Rhode Island farmhouse, you can see they have slightly different forms because of different weather conditions, different crop types, and different building traditions. So this connection between how these buildings look and why they look that way becomes sort of second nature to our understanding of where they are, and consequently where we are. As towns and cities eventually became more settled through the early 18th and 19th centuries, different regions developed these distinct craft building traditions that were shared and passed around among builders. You can think of these traditions sort of like the dialects or accents of a particular language. And these were expressed on buildings in the form of architectural details like this stonework. These are pictures from historic downtown Holland, Michigan. And they have this great craft tradition of this rusticated stone that kind of runs through the whole downtown from their major public buildings to just these sort of everyday storefronts. Other examples of this sort of local building culture include regionally common window types, like in Louisiana. These tall, slender windows help to pull a breeze in during the hot, humid months of the year. And there's also some good examples there of distinctive ironwork, which was a craft tradition passed around among builders that creates this beautiful and unified civic realm on buildings of different sizes, different heights, and different functions. And if we look at the Southwest, historic Albuquerque, New Mexico, their use of color is very different from the downtowns of those other two places. And I think in all of these examples, we have a strong sense of place because the local building cultures established a strong framework that was passed on and grew with each generation, and each new immigrant group who came in could assimilate their own cultures with the local building traditions. So as the 20th century unfolded, there were a series of events that were fairly consequential to the built environment, namely mass production and availability of the automobile and population expansion in the United States, particularly after the Second World War. And as the population grew, there developed this immense pressure for more housing and community amenities that were as fast, affordable, and mass-produced as the automobile. So while we were developing new efficiencies in standardized materials, we were also developing the interstate highway system that allowed us to ship those materials nationwide and removed some of the barriers that limited builders to only using local regional materials. At the same time, national corporations were franchising throughout the country, and there was a rise of modernism, which promoted an architectural character that was different from what had come before it. It was more sort of free from ornament and was dubbed the international style because it intentionally wanted to transcend some of these regional identities. So all of these factors together, we started to lose the value of building craft in favor of these bottom lines of efficiency, speed, and obsession with mechanization. And this led to a pretty major shift in development modes, namely from this one lot at a time, mixed-use, pedestrian-centric spaces that characterize the past, to these large-scale, single-developer buildings, usually on greenfield sites outside of the town center, because the land was cheaper and there were other demographic trends pushing people out of those towns. But this development had really infiltrated our mindset such that this is the kind of neighborhood shopping complex we build today, instead of something like this. And these two examples are both in Providence. They're about 4 blocks from each other. Same lot size, same amount of retail, but totally different character. What really got me thinking about this sort of character-dissolving architecture that we're building today were 2 hotel proposals that came into Providence at the end of 2015. So this is an aerial map. The historic city core is here. Some great residential neighborhoods on this side of the highway and on this side of the river. And right along where the highway came through, there are a bunch of vacant parcels, and so these are this sort of unbuilt gateway between the downtown and the neighborhoods to the west. So Best Western and Holiday Inn came in with these 2 proposals. And I looked on their websites to see what their place guidelines were for these designs, and they talked a lot about their market share, so namely secondary urban markets, business parks, and highway locations, but have nothing acknowledging what the local community wants or how the local community builds. So instead of referencing building traditions of New England, these hotels really only reference their own brands, materials, and colors. And so in Best Western's case, this is what we have to look at when we go from downtown into the neighborhood, this cheesy big blue glowing fin. And if it's successful, who knows, it could be in the Tri-Cities too. They're trying to bring this model to, to everywhere around the United States. If you look at their development website, they have a series of prototypes that developers can basically drag and drop with as little alteration as possible all over the country. So there's no need to worry about local building cultures or what the community wants. So if we agree that this de facto development is a problem, and that this is a problem that matters, what can we do about it? Obviously, there is no way that we can stop all buildings like this everywhere, and there are probably some places where this makes sense. So I want to narrow our focus a little bit and frame the question in this way. How can we encourage architecture and development that reinforces community character in our everyday built environment? Also, too, on the ground, this is a complicated and nuanced problem, and it can present itself slowly on a building-by-building basis. So it absolutely calls for nuanced solutions that are tailored to fit a case-by-case basis. But I think there are some broad roles that several disciplines have to play in setting ourselves on a track to build stronger regional identities, namely architecture and developers, historic preservation, government, and perhaps most importantly, the community. Since I'm an architect, I'm going to be selfish and start with the role of architecture. I think much of the history and culture of a place can be found by looking at its buildings, its spaces, its landscape architecture. So if we want to encourage new building that contributes to a distinct place, I think we need to find and define your city's overarching architectural themes. This is sort of like defining the dialect of a language. These are those architectural characteristics that make a region distinct. They don't have to be radically different. So in other words, Geneva's traditions and St. Charles traditions and Batavia's traditions may all be similar, but I think they should be readily apparent when you're in the place. They should be broad enough to tie together buildings of different types and sizes and eras. And once we find it, we should encourage new buildings to acknowledge that and use that dialect authentically. Basically, find what people love and do more of it. So where do we look for these sort of overarching architectural themes? Certainly in monumental major civic structures, like the St. Charles Town Hall or the Baker Hotel. But we don't want to ignore these sort of everyday buildings that we might pass on the street and get lost in the background fabric of the place. Those tell us a lot of important things about the traditions within a region. We also want to look at public and open spaces, so the places that groups of buildings create, where people meet and interact and rally, and where do they gather for leisure. And we also can't forget about the green spaces and the landscape architecture, the way that city and nature interact, in terms of the parks inside the city and also the farmland on the edges and those open spaces that you want to protect outside of the developable area. So what these architectural themes are not, certainly mindless copying. I think there's a critical distinction between copying a building type with no understanding of why it's designed that way versus using a similar form or detail with clear intent. This is kind of like a poet who, instead of studying the form of a sonnet and then writing a new poem in that form, just cuts up lines of famous sonnets and pastes them together at will. This is a great example. The house on the left is an authentic craftsman-style house, whereas the house on the right is a bad national developer's attempt at craftsman. It obviously doesn't really understand those forms and why it's being built that way. So we don't need to shy away from new architecture in a traditional style, but it does need to be done with integrity. The other thing that these architectural themes are not are narrow-minded or adverse to any new design ideas. I think the most vibrant regional traditions provide opportunity for invention within a well-established framework. So they allow for a balanced integration of variety and architecture that accommodates new functions and some new materials. I mean, if we go back to the language example, the English language is constantly evolving to be able to speak about things that weren't invented when it began. And there's great variety and creativity if we think about the great fiction writers, but they're all working within the same structure of an established language. So for some examples of this is a very early example. This is Irving Gill's work in San Diego. And he took the sort of traditional Spanish mission style that had been done there for quite a while and infused it with this sort of clean lines, the modern style was really starting to take effect, but his architecture, while feeling contemporary, also feels very indigenous to the region. This is a Holst Architecture group out of Massachusetts who did a new building in a historic district in Portland. Again, feels contemporary, but also feels contextual. Or one of my favorite firms, Lake Flato in Texas, and you can see here their work feels undeniably Texan, undeniably sort of Southwest in its form and its materials, but also undeniably contemporary and inventive. And the last thing that I want to say about the role of architecture is, if we consider a person's impression of a place, I think most often it's the larger whole, all the buildings put together, that have a greater impact than any single individual building. And this is especially important in well-knit historic districts. This is a picture of the Back Bay neighborhood in Boston. So if we think about regional context as a conversation, any new building is joining a conversation that's already in progress. So it can either join that conversation politely, or by screaming, "Hey, look at me," or "Hey, look at my brand," as in some of the hotels I showed earlier. And I think it's critical that buildings recognize their place in this conversation. And maybe sometimes you do need to scream, but often probably you don't. And in some ways, a building is really fulfilling its civic duty by being responsible and recognizing this conversation, what its context is, and how it's contributing to that collective whole. So we move on to the role of historic preservation in this endeavor. Preservation makes it possible to harness the power of the past. Historic buildings provide some of the most distinct character that's available to a region. It provides opportunities to repurpose abandoned buildings in advantageous locations, like the City Hall here. Or in Providence, we have a few old warehouse buildings on the river right near the center of town, and through historic preservation, we've been able to bring affordable housing and office space to sort of smart densify the town without encouraging sprawl. And as the representative said earlier, sustainability plays a huge role in this, thinking about using the existing energy of a building rather than demolishing it and starting new. And I think the trick with historic preservation is not to treat every historic building like a museum. Many times the best way to preserve a building is to creatively adapt it so you can continue using and loving it into the future. By way of example, there are two national hotel chains that do local particularly well, and they use historic preservation as a key component. Ash NYC is one, and the Ace Hotel Group is another. And their model is often to start with existing buildings rather than new ones. This is Ash's Dean Hotel in Providence. This is a pretty run-down and unfortunately notorious hotel right in the heart of the city, and they acquired it in 2013 and renovated it in about a year and a half to this beautiful hotel occupancy. And the room rates at this hotel are identical to the Courtyard Marriott or the Hilton Garden Inn right across the street, but it's obviously making a much nicer contribution to the city. And this is an Ace Hotel in Pittsburgh. This is a former YMCA that they acquired. It looked something like this, and they've been able to turn it into a really successful hotel. And the ground floor provides community event space for local nonprofits. So it contributes to the community in a variety of ways. These are no doubt more expensive than the Best Western model, but I think they're absolutely more sustainable, and certainly maybe provide some better competition against the Airbnb phenomenon. If we move to the role of government, I think the best thing that municipal leaders can do to encourage community-centric design is to create opportunity instead of onus. We could certainly have a whole separate talk about building regulations and how those affect the community, but I think a critical theme that consistently comes up in my experience is the most successful projects happen with a clear process and very clear expectations, where the information is easy to obtain from the government, the steps to approval are very apparent, and all parties know what to expect before they start that process. Providence recently overhauled our zoning ordinance, And when they did that, they hired a graphic design firm to come in and make the content more accessible. And what they ended up doing was creating this 20-page user manual, which is a really graphics-heavy kind of zoning ordinance for dummies. And it's fantastic. It goes through in very clear, simple terms what each of the zoning districts look like. It defines the terms in relatable English. It provides some information about how to read the various charts. And then at the end, there's a great flow chart of how the ordinance is administered. So if a potential developer is looking to come into the city, they can find out where their building is, which agencies they're going to need to contact, and what the steps are in that process. And thus far, it seems to be successful. We've heard some good feedback from developers and from the neighborhood groups. I was encouraged to see that the Geneva Historic guidelines seem to be a good step in that direction, in that they're accessible and have a lot of visual content. And I saw that St. Charles has a Plan Commission public hearing guide. So I'd be curious to know more about how those work in practice, and whether that's helped to make that process more clear to both the public and to developers and architectural teams. Another place that government can create opportunity for region-specific design is by making sure that zoning rules and tax incentives are set up such that smaller developers can develop 1 or 2 lots at a time. Often zoning codes are written such that really the only thing possible to build is sprawl or sort of auto-centric developments, or tax incentives are set up to only reward developers who can come in and develop an entire block. I think the difference in character between these two case studies for a block in Charleston can sort of speak for themselves. And it's not that we always have to develop 1 lot at a time, but we want to make sure that the system is flexible enough to allow that if that's what makes sense, and you have a smaller developer interested and willing to do that. The system shouldn't make that impossible. So finally, if we turn to the public, obviously, if we want community-centric design that provides an optimistic communal identity, then an engaged and equipped public is paramount. And the first part of that is showing up. I'm definitely preaching to the choir here, because again, you're here on a Saturday morning to talk about these things. But I think the second part is showing up with the right tools. And that's not always pitchforks and torches, but it's being knowledgeable about the community, and knowing what you hope to see come out of the process, and also knowing what your options for action are regarding what's being discussed. I think a key strategy is to find ways for the community to be proactive instead of just reactive. It's easy for a big crowd of people to show up when they oppose a project, but I think it's equally as, if not more productive, to show up before a project is brought to the table and propose some ideas. And this way, instead of being a NIMBY, not in my backyard community, you can be known as a YIMBY, yes in my backyard community, that encourages smart development. So it's important to get ahead of projects and really establish clearly what you want in terms of the pedestrian experience, the relationship between new buildings and historic properties, and the public space, the space that you inhabit on a regular basis. And then communicate that to potential developers and architects. And advocacy groups like the Preservation Partners, I think, are essential in this mission. You also want to make sure that everyone is invited to the table at the right time. So in Providence, 2 weeks ago, we had a public meeting about the future of a major park and public plaza. And so in addition to developers and city planners, they made sure that members of the homeless community and social service agencies were invited, because they are a major component of the users of that park, to get their suggestions about how to make the space better accessible to all. And then you also want to make sure that you close the feedback loop. And I think this responsibility for this falls a little bit on the government agencies too, but following up after public meetings and charrettes and making sure that the folks who were present and interested know what happened is important to a transparent and open process. The truth, though, is that you can't always get what you want in these things. And even the most transparent and open process can't guarantee that all sides will be happy. In fact, it won't guarantee that all sides will be happy. But I think it can help to achieve a desirable compromise. We all might want the Tesla, but maybe that's not on the table because the landowner can't afford it. So we've got zoning rules in place to make sure we get no less than the Pinto. And I think with adequate community participation, you can score a Prius, which is a pretty decent compromise. So I want to wrap up by presenting 3 case studies from Union Studio. This is us at our fall retreat this year. Really the overarching goal of this firm is to use our skills as architects and urban designers to make a civic contribution to communities of all types. And we've been able to do that. We have about 50% of our work in New England and about 50% of our work sort of around the country. And that's provided a really interesting variety of contexts in which to work. So this is, these will be 3 projects in Providence. This is a map of the city. It's sort of hard to see here, but the downtown core right here. The State House and most of the government buildings are just north of that, and then it's surrounded by mostly residential and mixed-use historic neighborhoods. And so the first project I want to talk about is the Capitol Square project, which illustrates a region-centric design approach to a community-driven mixed-use project. We were hired by a local nonprofit developer because this neighborhood needed some small commercial spaces and affordable housing. So this is our site here. It's right along the main east-west thoroughfare in this neighborhood. Again, it runs pretty much directly from the State House into a lot of the residential areas here. It's contiguous to a cemetery and to this kind of unfortunate public school that was built in the 90s and then added on to. It's huge, and unfortunately a little out of character with the neighborhood. But it also has this historic brick mixed-use building right next to it, which is a little bit different from the Smith Hill neighborhood, the residential area right to the south. And we've done some previous work in this neighborhood, so we knew most of its character were these triple-decker, 3-story gabled homes built in the late 18th, early 19th century. And the challenge for this commercial space was to knit these kind of residential features into a building that would also clearly read as public and commercial. So here's the site plan that we ended up with. We decided to split the building into 2, and that way we could create a gateway. There's a public open space, and we created a plaza here to front on that open space. And we tucked the parking behind to hold the street edge here and make that pedestrian experience a little bit more friendly. We followed a typical mixed-use plan, about 5,000 square feet of commercial space in these small, flexible bays with 12 affordable residential units ranging from 1 bedrooms to 3 bedrooms and 2 floors above. And this is what we came up with. You can see what's highlighted in yellow here. We took the residential forms and sort of put them on top. So the way that the building meets the sky, these bay details, the window sizing and proportion really relate back to the neighborhood. But from the pedestrian experience, you have this great commercial thoroughfare with large glazing and these pulled back entry porches that sort of invite you in. And by splitting them into 2 buildings, that provided a scale that more closely matched some of the neighborhood buildings. And again, we tried to use these simple, authentic details to match what were on those houses. I think this is my favorite shot of the project, this panorama here, that shows the way that this new building really knits together the residential fabric, but also clearly reads as a public space. So now we'll move down to the South Providence neighborhood and talk about the East Long Pond apartment project. This was a very community-centric project that leveraged historic preservation to help solve a major affordable housing crunch with the help of some creative municipal mechanisms. So this is the Parkus Comstock Historic District. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. In the late 19th century, this was pretty much the city's high society neighborhood. But as some major industry changes happened in the mid-20th century, many of these properties, many of these beautiful old houses were abandoned and foreclosed. So our work here centers on this Parkus Avenue corridor, which is full of these beautiful late Victorian houses, all on uniform lots. And in 2012, a group called AIDS Care Ocean State, which is a nonprofit group that works with families afflicted with AIDS and HIV, acquired these two houses and decided they wanted to turn them into a series of one-bedroom housing units. So here they are. They were built originally as family mansions in the late 1800s. Then they were converted to boarding houses in the 1960s and 70s. And then unfortunately in the 90s were essentially abandoned, walked away from, and left to decay. The insides are especially rough. You can see there's a little bit of DIY frescoing on the ceiling. And luckily, a lot of the original details were still intact. They were just under a lot of dust. So what we did, we knew that we didn't want to carve up the exterior of these buildings at all. So we figured out a way to solve the puzzle such that we could create a couple of logical one-bedroom units on the inside. So the second building here. And then do a full restoration on the outside. This is about a $2 million construction project. And most of the funds came from the HUD 811 program, which is a national funding program that provides funds for low-income housing for folks with disabilities. And another bunch of the funding came from our state housing agency. Here's some views of the completed interiors. Again, finding ways to mesh these kitchen and living spaces in without changing the exterior was a fun puzzle. And the contractors that were invited to bid on this were all contractors that had historic preservation experience. So they knew what they were getting into, and they took great care with a lot of these exterior details and a lot of the interior details. So these two apartment houses represent the latest in about a decade-long effort by nonprofits in this neighborhood to convert a number of these houses into affordable housing units. We also added a few new structures. It's sort of hard to see, but this carriage house is new, as is this structure here. And so now we have a pretty nearly intact street that also is affordable for most of the residents in the neighborhood. Another important note about this project, or what sort of made it possible, was the Rhode Island Rehabilitation Code. This was a building code that was adopted by the State Fire Board in 2002, and essentially it allows developers and architects to have a conversation with the Fire Board about how to bring these buildings up to a safe, reasonable level of modernity without having to meet like the latest code. So we didn't have to rip out all of the walls to put new insulation in, and we didn't have to put fire sprinklers in or put any of those exterior fire escapes on them that could really ruin the character of the building or make them completely financially unfeasible. And the last project I want to talk about, we're going to go over to the east side of Providence, which is right across the river from downtown. This is the land of Brown University and the Rhode Island School of Design, and a very intact historic neighborhood. This is the Thayer Street Student Housing Project, which is another mixed-use development that I think illustrates how community participation can really, that's grounded in a desire for region-specific design, can come up with a sort of win-win outcome. The local developer had somehow acquired rights to these 9 historic homes and planned to demolish them to create 1,000 square feet of retail, 4 floors of student housing, and about 80 underground parking spaces. This unfortunately sort of defies what I was talking about earlier about sort of a single block development, but the university really needed housing, and they have a master plan overlay that allows them to do things like this. So it's a challenging site because on one side they front this beautiful residential neighborhood, a lot of great old historic homes that still function as single-family residences. But on the other side, they're immediately adjacent to this low-rise commercial development, which is really the heart of College Town in Providence. So on this site, they're essentially at the linchpin, and they have to relate to both. So here they sat. We weren't the original architects that were called in on the project. They had an out-of-town group who came in and created this big single-block development with an interior courtyard that had no connections to the street, and their elevation looked something like this. And it does some things well. It's definitely not a bad elevation, but it also really feels like a kind of whole block development. And so they presented this to the neighborhood groups, who all said no. And they went back 3 times, and they changed their design radically 3 times, and they said no all 3 times, especially in the residential district. They felt like this really didn't represent Providence or the kind of character that they wanted in the neighborhood. So at this point, the developer called Union Studio and asked us if we would consult on the facade design and recommend some ways to fit into the regional character. So we took a walk around the neighborhood and looked at some of the ways that other major whole block student housing on the Brown and RISD campuses were successful. How did they knit themselves into that residential fabric? And then we went back to their facade, sort of abstracted its pieces and took a look at the way that it was segmented up, and decided that the best way to minimize the scale and impact of this building was to break down the elevation into an assemblage of essentially 3 legible building forms that vary in scale and texture, and would allow it then to relate to both sides of the site. So that led us to this sketch here. So the first building type would be a mercantile commercial building that would sit on the commercial street. We have a hyphen here that leads to the underground parking, and then a residential wing that would create these gabled roof forms every so often, and speak more to the residential forms on the neighborhood side. And this is the elevation that we ultimately landed at. We also talked about the 4th story here. We encouraged them to set that back a little bit and use a different material. So it started to feel more like an attic story, and you get the sense that rather than being a 4-story building that's sort of imposing itself on the street, it's kind of a 3-story building with an attic story. Here are the renderings. So this is on that commercial side, what the mercantile building looks like. And then this is the back in the residential neighborhoods. And the other thing that we did was we encouraged them to break open that corridor in the back. And this did lead to a loss or a sort of reconfiguration of the plans. And I think they lost a few rooms in the shuffle, but it was ultimately worthwhile because they now had a connection to the street from that interior courtyard. And it broke down the massing of the building on the residential side such that they had smaller forms that were more relatable to those house scales. And this is what they ultimately built. Unfortunately, we weren't contracted to go through construction administration, so they botched some of the details on the outside, which is too bad, but for the most part, they did a great job, especially on the residential side, and I think it fits the character, and what the feedback that we've heard is this really, this feels like Providence, and it feels like the right scale for this neighborhood. So what I hope you can see from those case studies is that when architecture and historic preservation and the government and the public are aligned on a common set of goals, they can create places that elevate a community's everyday experiences. I think region-specific, community-centric development is really a crucial part of fostering a sense of belonging to a place, which then leads to stewardship of that place. This kind of good development makes a place worth caring about. So worth drawing these beautiful historic maps of. In St. Charles, we've got to get an artist to draw you one, because Geneva and Batavia have these beautiful maps. We need one for you. But the other task at hand is to continue advocating in the present for design that takes these distinctive places seriously, that learns from and harmonizes with and expands on the past, and creates places that will be well worth preserving in the future. So, thank you very much. Like this, I'd really encourage you to check out commonedge.org. That's how Margaret found me, and there are a lot of architects and designers talking about issues like this. And again, thank you to the Preservation Partners.